Hello YouTube, this is the Asian Theist here, and I am back with a video that was actually on my mind for a long time. Unfortunately, complications in my personal life have more or less prevented a video response from happening back in the day, but I suppose late is better than never. Anyways, in this video, Hemant Mehta, or the Atheist Voice, attempts to tell us why thanking God after surviving a tragedy is cruel. It's interesting how atheists criticize religion for policing what we can do and say, and yet here is an atheist, apparently, trying to police what we can do and say. Let's see what he has to offer us.
You may have heard about a recent tragedy in Branson, Missouri, where 17 people died after the boat they were on for a special tour was caught in a storm, flipped over, and trapped people underneath. It was horrific. Fewer than half of the people on the boat survived. One of the survivors was a 15-year-old girl, and as you can imagine, her mother, who wasn't on the boat, was so thankful to learn her daughter was alive. And she said something to reporters that sounds perfectly normal. She said she felt fortunate that God spared my child. God spared her child.
I'm not going to bother trying to verify all the facts of the story itself, as the main issue I have with this video is what he says next.
Now look, I have no desire to criticize anyone whose emotions have been through hell and back, but I think this statement needs to be analyzed because it's such a common sentiment.
This is where the fun begins.
If God spared her child, the implication is that God chose not to spare the lives of any of those 17 other people. In this mother's mind, the same God who killed those people allowed her daughter to make it out alive, and she's praising him for it.
Before we continue, I would like to point out that this video will be taking a purely argumentative approach to this subject. However, I would also like to point out that I am in no way insensitive to those in mourning. Grief and anger are things that are to be expressed and experienced and are certainly not things that can be cured with a few philosophical arguments. This is coming from a guy who is old enough to be a father. Therefore, I would like to add a disclaimer that nothing in this video should be expected to bring comfort to anyone going through grief. This is purely for discussion and analysis. Now, back to the topic. Even if we could presume for certain purposes that God quote-unquote killed those other people, this appears to be predicated under the assumption that God was under some moral obligation to keep them alive in the first place. More on that later.
Now look, obviously the mother wasn't intentionally trying to say something awful, but that doesn't mean it's not a completely warped way of thinking. If you're thanking God after a tragedy, then God deserves blame for the death and destruction too.
It may be understandable to feel negative emotions towards God after such an experience, but it's also arguably unreasonable from a theoretical point of view. This isn't coming from me, by the way, but from the modern-day philosopher Shelley Kagan, who is a non-Christian and has debated Christians in the past. There are no doubt other philosophers who hold similar views, like Aristotle or the Stoics, for instance, but Shelley Kagan has covered this issue a little more directly. To illustrate the point, let me read the following from his novel, On Death. According to Shelley Kagan, in order for anger against someone to be justified, the following conditions must be met. 1. Something bad needs to happen to you, or be likely to happen to you, like dying prematurely. 2. The anger needs to be directed at an agent that has some kind of control over what they're doing. Being angry at something like the weather, for instance, doesn't make sense as the weather is not an agent and had no choice or control. 3. The agent has wronged you in the sense that they have treated you in a way that was morally inappropriate. In terms of whether anger against God is justified when you or someone you love is taken before their time, so to speak, Kagan is of the view that anger against God is not justified. Here's a shortened version of what he writes. Since God is a person, it might well be appropriate to be angry at God for condemning us to lives that are so short, relative to the riches that the world offers us. But what about the second of the further conditions? Has God wronged us? If not, then anger or resentment at God doesn't make sense. Suppose that someone at work has a box of candy, and she gives you a piece, which you enjoy. Then she gives you a second piece, and you enjoy that as well. And then she gives you a third, which you also enjoy. Imagine that you ask her for a fourth piece of candy, and she won't give it to you. Has she wronged you? Does she owe you more candy? If not, then being angry is inappropriate. Of course, I might understand if you got angry in that this might be a common enough response. The appropriate response actually seems to me to be not one of anger, but gratitude. Your office mate didn't owe you any candy at all. You might wish you could have more, you might be sad that you can't have more, but anger doesn't seem appropriate. Similarly, then, anger at God might be inappropriate as well. As far as I can see, God doesn't owe it to us to give us any more life than what we get. It seems to me that the right emotional response isn't fear, it isn't anger, it's gratitude that we are able to be alive at all. If Shelley Kagan's writings are anything to go on, the mother's reaction of thanking God for sparing her daughter's life was actually appropriate, as she apparently understands that life was not to be taken for granted. If atheists want to assert that God is obligated to prolong our lives, then the burden of proof is on them. Now, before you atheists start using the Epicurean paradox in the comments section, please check out one of my previous videos on the existence of evil.
Or, hear me out here, maybe a better God would have stopped the storm from happening in the first place.
This is assuming that God is accountable to your standards of a better God, which is not the case for the reasons already given.
Or better yet, blame someone who actually deserves it. Like the captain who didn't make everyone wear life jackets.
I find it pretty ironic that atheists constantly whine about God being this invasive tyrant, while also being upset at the fact that he isn't babysitting them all the time.
As someone else once said, thanking God for sparing you in a disaster is like sending a thank you note to the serial killer for stabbing the family next door.
That analogy fails for one obvious reason. Unlike the serial killer, God is allowed, morally speaking, to shorten our lives if he wishes, and this notion is supported by even non-Christian academics. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and to share this video if you want to help the channel grow, and tap the bell icon to be notified immediately when the next video is up. In the meantime, this is the Asian Theist, signing off.